So you have a little money in your pocket, you realize that creating things can be valuable. It's the 80s, so software and computers are just starting to come into the main thought patterns of people. Yeah. What do you do at that time? Where do you go from that first software program to, say, college?
Yeah, the first two things that I did that were really work-related that were significant were, one, the summer between my junior and senior year, I went and spent in London. And I worked for a company called Centronics.
London, UK, not London,
UK.
Ontario.
London, UK.
Okay.
And Centronics was a company, for people that remember the early personal computer, they created what became called the parallel port. So it was the interface that your printer plugged into.
Okay.
It used to be called a Centronics port. And they were, for a while, a company that was pretty prominent with dot matrix printers. And they really were sort of a market leader in that area. And the way a dot matrix printer worked was it had a thing that fired off a bunch of pins, and you programmed what was called at the time a ROM or an EEPROM that was the character set. And the way they created the character sets for the letter A, for which dots to fire and all that, was they literally used graph paper.
Really?
And they drew all the little circles on graph paper and then coded it based on which was on and which was off for each letter.
Got it.
Okay? I wrote a piece of software, a program on the Apple computer that automatically allowed you to graphically do it and then press a button and generate it. That was my summer project. And I got paid for that summer project in a printer.
So you almost worked for your printer.
So I worked for my printer. The second sort of early experience that I had working was the next summer, I went to work for a husband and wife company that made software for the oil and gas industry.
So this was your senior year of high school?
Senior year before college.
Before college.
And this was at the very beginning of the personal computer. So the Apple computer was out, the Apple III had just come out, the IBM PC had not yet come out.
Okay.
And I spent the summer and I wrote a couple of pieces of software for this husband and wife company, and they were the two founders, I was the first employee, that were scientific and technical software for oil and gas exploration.
Okay.
So I had to learn a lot about something I knew nothing about, but then I also wrote the software that ended up being commercialized. And the deal that I had with them, my employment arrangement was they paid me $10 an hour.
Okay.
So I figured out pretty quickly that I made twice as much money if I worked 80 hours a week instead of 40. And then I also got 5% of gross sales of all the software that I wrote.
Which is pretty unusual for a teenager to get a piece of the future revenue.
It was unusual, but it was entrepreneurial. So It would have not been that different than if they'd given me some equity in the company, although that wasn't really in vogue at that time. And they weren't paying me very much per hour, because if they were paying a full-time person, it would have been 3 or 4 times that probably for the same full-time person. That's when I went off to school that fall. I got royalty checks, and I get a royalty check for $1,000 one month, and then I get a check for $2,500, and then I get a check for $10,000, and then another check the next month for $2,500. And I really understood sort of the value of creating something.
And getting
then getting essentially sort of ongoing ownership in it. So those were the early vectors, both in terms of creating software, creating technology that were real products, as well as an understanding sort of how the business worked. The last part of that cycle, which was a really profound moment for me, was I went back and worked for them again the following summer. I worked throughout the school year with them. They bought me a computer, and I maintained the software.
So now you're in college. You're continuing to work with them.
The next summer, I went back home to Dallas, which is where I grew up, Dallas, Texas. And I worked for them, and they had grown from 3 people the summer before to 20 people. So they had this very, very steep growth curve. And in 1984, what happened to the price of oil was in the summer of 1984, it went from $30 a barrel to $10 a barrel. Mm-hmm. And those were all their customers were companies doing oil and gas exploration. And what happened was literally overnight the phone stopped ringing. And the company at the end of the summer was back down to a couple of people. And so I had this experience very early of the cycle of a business that grows very, very, very quickly because of a product, but then because of some exogenous factor or factor within the business collapsed.
So you learn that even as an entrepreneur, no matter how hard you work, there are externalities that can influence the success. You say it was profound. 20 years later, how is it still affecting you?
Well, 2 things. One is the entrepreneurs didn't give up. So this is 1984, and the entrepreneurs, Chris and Helen Aves were the entrepreneurs. Chris had this belief that the record was going to be replaced by the CD. The CD had just come out, and there were no retail stores for CDs.
And still record stores.
Still record stores. So he opened the first, in the United States, the first CD-only store.
Wow.
And he took the software that he'd written for oil and gas accounting, and he modified some of the pieces of the software. He continued to maintain the existing customers that were still in business, so he got some revenue from that. rebuilt a new product that was a retail point of sale product.
So using the same underlying concepts,
Same
so
basic
a little bit
ideas.
of a pivot on top, though. Was
That's
that your
right.
first pivot that you got to see?
It was yeah, probably the first pivot. And in that, he then ended up creating a business. He had a successful CD store for a little while. But really, what he was creating was a way to build a piece of software that he then sold to all the CD stores that appeared across the country.
So he could double dip. He could use some of the same technology, but repackage it
That's
and
right.
resell it.
And the thing that sort of, if you follow the arc, 20-something years later, is this notion that you can create something out of nothing, that the path of creating something out of nothing is not easy, and it's often very unpredictable, even when you have steep success. And that success is fleeting. And it doesn't, just because you have some success for some period of time, doesn't necessarily mean that you have a sustainable phenomena as a business. And all of those things happened to me when I was like, 18, 19 years old, on the front lines, because I was close to them. They were mentors to me. I was, an important
He was
part
putting
of
money in your
their
pocket. It
business.
was relevant to
That's right. And when the royalty checks went from, even $1,000 a month to zero, and then the next month there was no check, I didn't think I was getting screwed because they weren't sending me checks. I knew they weren't selling any software, right? So sort of all of
reality
those
sort of sets in,
connections
yeah.
were pretty important early on.